I found a shoebox of receipts in my aunt's closet. She'd been secretly paying neighbors' medical bills for years. I never expected that an afternoon of sorting through old papers would change how I see my whole neighborhood. After the funeral, the apartment felt like someone had pressed pause on a life. Cups in the sink, a cardigan draped over a chair, a calendar with last month's appointment circled. My Aunt Eleanor had lived alone for years. She was quiet, called on Sundays, and always seemed to know everyone's names. Cleaning felt like a duty. I agreed to take what I could, throw what was trash, and hand the rest to Mom. I started in her bedroom closet. There were shoeboxes full of faded photographs and a pile of neatly stacked envelopes tied with a rubber band. At the bottom of the box, under a packet of crossword puzzles, I found a stack of medical receipts and pharmacy receipts. Dozens of them stretched across years. At first I thought they belonged to her. Then I saw handwriting on the back of one. Harold, March. Harold. That name jogged something loose in my memory. The man from 401B who shuffled his mail when the building had a leak last winter. The receipts weren't all for Eleanor. Many had names I recognized. Mrs. Carter from the third floor, the Rivera family from the corner deli, a couple of others I had seen in the hallway. The totals were small, a $60 prescription here, $100 toward a specialist there. But it was the regularity that got me. Month after month, year after year, Eleanor had been paying for medicine and co-pays and occasional doctor visits for other people, quietly sliding envelopes to pharmacists or leaving cash in marked places. I sat down on the floor among the receipts and felt suddenly intrusive and grateful at the same time. How many times had I walked past her mailbox without knowing the secret ledger she kept? I felt foolish for not asking and ashamed for never understanding how private she must have been. Still, I knew right then I couldn't just file the receipts away. If she had been doing this quietly for years, it felt like an obligation to follow through, at least to find out who she'd been helping and whether anyone still needed help. I started with Harold. The building manager gave me his key and a warning. He's private, keep it simple. Harold opened the door wearing a cardigan and a face like someone who'd seen too many winters. He squinted at me for a second and then recognition softened his features when I told him who I was. He didn't remember my aunt well by name at first, but when I said she used to bring him soup sometimes, his eyes filled just enough to make the telling pause sensible. He shuffled to a small table where a box of medicine sat. I showed him one of the receipts with his name. He stared at it, then at me, like someone discovering a ghost had planted a lifeline months ago. "She paid?" he asked, voice cracked but steady. He said he'd been ashamed to accept help. He'd lost his wife a few years back and tried to be stubborn about expenses. Didn't want folks to think I couldn't handle my own bills, he said. The receipts proved otherwise. Eleanor had quietly paid for insulin refills and a cardiology copay when the clinic submitted a bill. That afternoon, we sat at his kitchen table. He told me stories, short, clipped recollections of hospital corridors, of nights he couldn't sleep because of pain, of Eleanor dropping off casseroles and refusing credit. I took notes on my phone, more to keep facts straight than to memorialize. Harold's gratitude was real but cautious. He instinctively wanted to say he could have managed if he'd known, which I think was his way to preserve dignity. On my way out, Harold handed me a folded paper, an address and a name. Mrs. Carter, Apt 3C. She gets pills every month. It was the first thread. In the foyer, under the fluorescent light, I realized this wasn't a one-off. My aunt had been running a quiet safety net from her kitchen table, and now it was up to me to see what held it together. Once you start looking, patterns show up. Over the next week I tracked down 3 more names from the envelopes. Mrs. Carter, the Rivera kid's mother, and a man named Sam who lived alone and sometimes slept in the community room. Each conversation repeated the same small miracle. Someone with a soft-spoken explanation, a modest shrug about pride, and a memory of an unannounced check or a sealed envelope left under a doormat. Mrs. Carter, who worked part-time at the library, hugged me like I was the one in need of comfort when I showed her a receipt for a prescription she'd thought she'd paid herself. Eleanor would come by, she said. Leave a note on my door. For March, she'd write. I always thought it was for someone else. She avoided talking about the times when she couldn't choose between medication and heat. When she did, the admission was a small, private thing. The Rivera family were immigrants from El Salvador, hard-working folks who ran the deli by the corner stop. Their baby had been in and out of clinics for allergies. They had been too proud to ask for help. She said, "No, this is for the baby," the mom told me in halting English. I translated, we laughed awkwardly, and there was this weird warm helplessness at the center of it. Sam was harder. He looked at me like a man holding his breath in a small boat. He told me he had been a machinist, injured on the job, and that Eleanor had covered a medical deductible he couldn't manage. He'd tear up when he thought no one was watching. Collecting these stories felt invasive and intimate at once. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering something tender, an underground river of support my aunt had kept flowing. It was also becoming clear she wasn't just helping out of casual kindness. She kept ledger-like notes, dates written in the margins, small amounts matched to a purpose. I took photographs of the receipts and began transcribing names, amounts, and dates into a spreadsheet on my laptop. It felt clinical to reduce these lives to rows and columns, but it was necessary if this was going to continue in any organized way. The more I documented, the more I saw that people needed more than one-off payments. The receipts told stories of repetition, months where the same prescription reappeared. My aunt had quietly shouldered recurring costs. That meant a plan would have to be sustainable. I couldn't just replace a person with an envelope every month. I needed to create something that could continue. I started small. I met with the local pharmacist, genuinely surprised and moved when I explained. He remembered Eleanor. He offered to flag any prescriptions with unpaid balances for people with matching names. He suggested working with the clinic for sliding scale billing options. Together we drafted a simple form to authorize the transfer of bill notices to someone acting on behalf of the deceased, something easier in theory than practice, given privacy rules. The pharmacist offered to accept stamped envelopes for a month without asking too many questions. A temporary bridge. Next, I went to the community clinic and explained the situation to the social worker. She gave practical advice. Check for eligibility for state assistance programs, gather medical records, and look into charity funding through local health foundations. We scheduled appointments for those who were open to it, sometimes with translators. It wasn't all bureaucratic fixes. On a rainy Wednesday, I set up a small meeting in the community room with Harold, Mrs. Carter, and Sam. I brought coffee and the handwritten ledger. We read through it together, slowly, like people unwrapping something fragile. Some were embarrassed, others openly cried. It was awkward and tender and necessary. We agreed that I would handle immediate bills for 2 months while we pursued longer-term solutions. Applications for assistance, charity funding, and community donations. Taking action made me feel less like a voyeur and more like a steward. Eleanor had left a map I hadn't asked for, and now the neighborhood was willing to follow it. Tentatively, imperfectly, but willing. It felt like the beginning of something practical instead of just a story to be mourned. Not everyone approved. When I told my sister about the receipts and the people Eleanor had been helping, she was skeptical. Why would she hide it from us? She asked. What if someone takes advantage? Our family had a modest inheritance argument a few days earlier. People wrestling over furniture and whose name went with which photo frame. My sister worried my effort might be abused or misinterpreted by relatives who didn't know the whole picture. I tried to stay clear-headed. I showed her the ledger and explained the checks and pharmacy slips. I explained that my goal wasn't to give away money willy-nilly, but to connect people with resources and be transparent. She softened when I told her about Harold and the Riveras, but warned me about opening the floodgates. Are you ready to be responsible for people you barely know? She asked. That question stung. She was right. Taking this on would change my routine and my energy. I work full-time. My life wasn't built to be a social service. I didn't want to be a do-gooder who burned out. So I set boundaries, limited hours for outreach, clear documentation of every expense, and monthly check-ins. I also asked my sister to help with bookkeeping. If nothing else, it would prevent family friction and keep things honest. Then there were practical hurdles. Some pharmacies required signatures. Clinics needed HIPAA-authorized paperwork to release information. For the Rivera family, immigration status and language barriers made navigating assistance programs slow. I learned that intention alone wouldn't save anyone. Infrastructure did. But there were small wins too. A local church offered to cover 1 month's prescriptions, a food pantry arranged delivery for 2 families, and a neighbor with a truck volunteered to pick up medications. Momentum mattered. I kept a simple notebook with a list of tasks and crossed them off like someone managing a small project. On hard days, when paperwork felt endless, I went back to the shoebox with receipts and read a single note from Eleanor. Keep the list moving. It felt like permission and responsibility, pressed into ink. As the weeks passed, the informal system needed tightening. I created a simple ledger, columns for the date, name, purpose, amount, and follow-up steps. I set up a small dedicated envelope fund, money from my savings and a few contributions from neighbors, which I kept in a lockbox at the community center. Transparency became my watchword. Receipts, notes, and any transfers were photographed and stored both digitally and in a physical folder. I met with a volunteer accountant at the senior center who taught me how to make a basic budget. This isn't charity theater, she said. It's bookkeeping. She helped me draft a short code of conduct. No loans, only direct payments to providers, and a written consent form from recipients where possible. That reduced awkwardness and protected donors and recipients alike. Outreach became routine. Tuesday mornings I spent calling clinics to check eligibility. Thursday afternoons were for home visits. I kept the interactions practical. For Mrs. Carter, we found a payment plan for arrears at the heat company. For Harold, we connected him with a transportation voucher program so he could get to cardiology without risking missed appointments. For Sam, the clinic found a work rehab program that evaluated his capacity for a light-duty position. One afternoon, a neighbor, a retired teacher named Joan, asked if she could volunteer to make weekly phone calls to folks who might be lonely. She brought a notebook and an uncanny ability to remember birthdays. Another neighbor, a pharmacist named Daniel, began setting aside a small discount for prescriptions he knew were recurrent. The community started to help themselves without any announcements. Just quiet, practical contributions. There were setbacks. A reimbursement request got lost in bureaucracy, a family member tried to claim a receipt was misused, and I had to spend time clarifying and defending the ledger. But those tests hardened the system rather than breaking it. Rules made it fairer, and fairness mattered. I learned that small amounts of money could have outsized effects when combined with practical support, transport, documentation help, and emotional presence. By the third month, what began as a few envelopes had turned into a modest neighborhood practice. People on our block began recognizing each other not by titles or jobs but by need and contribution. The Rivera Deli started a small tab where a portion of morning coffee sales was set aside for the fund. The church hall allowed us to use the basement once a month for paperwork nights. Word spread quietly, not on social media but through person-to-person recommendations. I started keeping a short list of micro-goals. Enroll one person in assistance, resolve a back bill, get a prescription on automatic refills. These practical steps built trust. I remember the day we helped Mrs. Carter apply for a low-income subsidy. She came back the next week with a cooked pie, embarrassed but happy. "Food is all I've got to give," she said. We took the pie and ate it in the community room with a mismatched set of mugs and the giant ledger on the table like a strange kind of Bible. Recruiting volunteers was organic. People who had once been on the receiving end of Eleanor's aid asked to help because they wanted to give back. A young couple who ran a home-based bakery offered free lunches for a clinic day. A high school student offered to translate forms for Spanish-speaking neighbors for community service credit. These connections mattered as much as money, sometimes more. I watched people start to rely on each other the way neighborhoods used to, before everything went behind apps and screens. The ledger grew. I learned when to step back. Running the fund didn't mean being the sole doer. It meant creating pathways for others to contribute. On a practical level, we began to see measurable outcomes. 3 people were consistently able to refill chronic meds, 2 had stabilized housing situations, and 1 person found part-time work after months of inactivity. The victories were quiet. No press. No ribbon cutting. Just a neighborhood that recognized need and responded. It felt like slow, honest repair work. There were moments when the emotional weight of other people's hardship hit me hard. One evening I visited Sam. He'd had a rough week, an appointment pushed back and a mood spiraling toward resignation. He'd been diagnosed with chronic pain and had trouble sleeping. We sat on his couch under a lamp with a shade the color of old tea. He told me about the job he'd lost and the way a small debt grows bigger when you ignore it. He said, "It's not just money, it's dignity." I understood him in a way I hadn't before. To address recurring needs, I organized a modest fundraiser, a community potluck and bake sale. We set up folding tables in the park. The Rivera family sold empanadas. The bakery couple brought pastries. Joan brought sandwiches cut diagonally with toothpicks. It was imperfect, a windy day, some burn marks on cookies, people forgetting cash. But we raised enough to cover 3 months of predictable prescriptions and created an awareness that felt more permanent than handouts. We also applied for a small grant from a local community foundation. Filling out the application required data. How many people we helped, the kind of aid, receipts, and client testimonials. That process forced us to be rigorous. It disciplined us into a better managed effort. The grant came through partially, enough to help formalize the lockbox and pay for basic printing of forms and translation services. I remember the first time a neighbor called me not to ask for help, but to say thank you because their elderly father could finally afford eye drops that made his world less blurry. That call made every filing and awkward conversation worth it. It wasn't always straightforward or noble. I had to say no sometimes. There were requests that crossed my boundaries: loans, risky investments, or things outside our mandate. Saying no hurt, but limits kept us focused and sustainable. People began to notice. A reporter from the local paper called after a volunteer mentioned us in passing. I was nervous about publicity. Part of me wanted to stay private. Eleanor had preferred it that way. But publicity would bring resources and volunteers. We agreed to a short piece that framed it as a neighborhood initiative started with an ordinary list of receipts. The story ran on a Wednesday. Calls came in. A retired librarian offered to create a small filing system. A church donated space. A lawyer volunteered to help with consent forms. The additional attention also meant we had to tighten standards. More requests, more vetting. I hired a basic email and a simple website to explain who we helped and how donations were used. Real change came in small, practical increments. Harold, who had once missed appointments because of lack of transport, started using a voucher service coordinated through us and now attends cardiac rehab twice a week. Mrs. Carter, stabilized on medication, volunteered at the library 2 afternoons a week. Sam enrolled in a vocational rehab class and began doing light assembly work 5 hours a week. The Rivera family started a small catering side hustle and hired an extra person. At the monthly meeting, we kept the ledger open. The paper would sit in the center of the table, names in one column, actions in another. People would point at a name and say, "She needs glasses," or "He needs a ride Wednesday." Solutions would come from surprising places. A retired optometrist offered discounted exams. A neighbor with a spare car set up a schedule for rides. I learned that community resilience looks like small redundancies, a dozen people each willing to do a little. It isn't heroic, it's consistent. That was the lesson Eleanor had already taught. I was merely translating it into forms and schedules. A year after I first opened the shoebox, we had a modest but steady operation. We named it Eleanor's List, a clumsy but honest name. We were not a nonprofit with a big office. We were a cooperative of neighbors, a mail slot at a community center, a ledger that fit into a drawer but did real work. I filed for the basic paperwork to become a fiscal sponsor under the bigger community foundation, which allowed us to accept tax-deductible donations without the overhead of a full legal structure. The most powerful thing I noticed wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet, it was behavior change. People started to look after one another with intention. I began each week with a short list of urgent tasks and ended it with a handful of small successes. Someone who'd avoided an ER visit because they had meds, a disabled veteran who now had better mobility aids, a single mom whose child received an inhaler on time. Personally, my life adjusted. I learned to be practical about my limits. An hour here, a meeting there, documented receipts, and clear consent. My sister and I reconciled over the ledger. She came on board and helped vet requests. We would sit at her kitchen table with takeout and go over applications. A new family routine that felt strangely comforting. There were hard nights, receiving an urgent call at 2 a.m., dealing with bureaucracy, or watching someone break down in gratitude because help felt both overdue and humiliating. But those nights taught me how to be patient and clear. Eleanor's practice had been dignified because she respected privacy. We honored that by keeping confidentiality and empowering people to be part of the solution. Update: 6 months later. 6 months after the organization went public, and nearly 18 months since that afternoon in the closet, I find myself measuring success in rhythms. Not because there's a flashy metric, but because households that once teetered are steady enough to plan. Harold comes to community lunches on Fridays, smiling and telling corny jokes. Mrs. Carter teaches a casual reading hour at the library. Sam now handles light deliveries for the deli and laughs about his own clumsiness. We supported 23 households this year in a hands-on way: direct payments for prescriptions, transportation coordination, paperwork help, and periodic food support. The community fund, with small recurring donations and a few grants, covers predictable needs for a quarter at a time. Volunteers rotate responsibilities, so no single person bears the load. The ledger has become a living document of accountability rather than a secret list. I feel a steady, quiet joy. It's not triumphal, it's practical. It's seeing neighbors become neighbors again. People who check on each other, swap favors, and notice when someone is missing from the porch. My own life feels fuller in a deliberate way. I sleep differently knowing that small systems can prevent crises and that Eleanor's private kindness grew into a public practice for caring.